It had only been 6 months since I got married, but my husband was already consumed by his desire for a child. He desperately wanted a son. Because of this, he followed every piece of advice from his spiritual teacher, a figure he called Ustad Molla. Each day under Ustad Molla's guidance, my husband would insist on being intimate with me, leaving me exhausted and drained. Despite my attempts to reason with him, to remind him that the gift of children lies in God's hands and that it was too soon to be so fixated on the matter, he refused to listen. Whatever Ustad Molla told him, he followed without question. Although I had never seen this teacher, I had grown to resent him deeply. One night, after yet another exhausting episode, I fell into a deep sleep, only to be jolted awake at dawn. My eyes snapped open, and to my horror, I saw a strange man sitting right beside me, staring at my face with unsettling intensity. A scream escaped my lips as the full weight of what I was seeing struck me. There in my own bedroom was a man I had never met, watching me as I slept. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. He adjusted his posture slightly, but made no move to explain himself or break his gaze. It was as though he knew me well, though I had no idea who he was. My instincts screamed at me to flee, and as I got up to leave, he suddenly grabbed my arm. I froze, stunned by his audacity. My voice returned, and I began yelling for help. Moments later, my husband rushed into the room. To my shock, he didn't react the way I expected. Instead of demanding to know what was happening or confronting the intruder, he calmly asked me why I was screaming. His nonchalant demeanor left me speechless. I wanted to scream at him. "Are you crazy? Don't you see that a stranger has entered our room?" But I was too shaken to speak. Then my husband glanced behind me and said, "Oh, there's nothing to be afraid of. This is Ustad Molla." I stared at him, dumbfounded. He looked completely relaxed, as if this was a perfectly normal situation. Meanwhile, my legs felt weak beneath me, my entire body trembling from the encounter. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Who was this man, and how could my husband act as though his presence was nothing out of the ordinary? When I turned back to look at the intruder, Ustad Molla, apparently, he was still there, his eyes fixated on me in the same invasive, disgusting way. I felt repulsed, as though his very presence tainted the air. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to push him out of my home, but my husband's attitude held me back. I couldn't understand how he could be so calm in the face of something so deeply wrong. Unable to bear it any longer, I rushed out of the room, ignoring my husband's attempts to stop me. Once in another room, I broke down in tears. I sobbed until my chest ached, the fear and anger overwhelming me. My life had been nothing but turmoil since coming into this house. It seemed like there was no peace, no moment of calm. This new issue, the presence of Ustad Molla, was just another unbearable weight to carry. In the background, I could hear my husband apologizing to Ustad Molla, saying, "Please forgive her, Ustad Ji. She doesn't know any better. Don't worry, I'll explain everything to her. Please, have a seat." But I didn't stay to hear the rest. I didn't want to know what else he would say or what else this mysterious man might do. Instead, I retreated further into the house, feeling more trapped and helpless than ever before. For the first time, I found myself truly furious at my husband. I felt betrayed and abandoned. Why would he bring this man into our home without even telling me? Who was this Ustad Molla, and what did he want from me? Why did my husband place more trust in him than in his own wife? These questions haunted me as I sat there, tears streaming down my face. The life I had imagined when I first got married seemed impossibly far away. Now all I felt was fear and anger, and the growing certainty that something had to change before it was too late. I had decided that I would speak to my husband that evening and make it clear that I never wanted that man to set foot in our home again. His gaze was deeply unsettling, and I couldn't bear it any longer. When I finally got the chance to bring it up, my husband's reaction stunned me. Instead of trying to understand my concerns, he became angry. "Are you out of your mind?" he snapped. "What are you talking about? He's my teacher, a highly respected figure. I can't stop him from coming here, no matter what you say. This is his home as much as ours. He's welcome any time, and you should accept that. It's for your benefit, too. He's helping you prepare so you can give me the son I've always dreamed of." His response left me speechless. He hadn't even considered my feelings or the gravity of what I was saying. I was frustrated and hurt, and in a moment of desperation, I told him that if he refused to listen, I would leave and go back to my mother's house for good. He didn't seem the least bit concerned. "You're free to leave any time you want," he replied coldly. "And when you decide to come back, the door will always be open for you." His indifference crushed me. My eyes welled up with tears as I thought about how I had fought with my family to marry this man, believing he was the one. Now it was all falling apart, and I felt trapped. I picked up my phone and called my mother. As soon as she heard my voice, she sounded exasperated. "If you're calling to complain, save your breath," she said. "I warned you about him. I have no more words to spare." Before I could reply, she hung up. My last lifeline had just been severed. I broke down completely after that, crying so hard it felt as if my chest would split open. Through my tears, I could hear my husband and his teacher talking outside. The sound of my name being called jolted me back to reality. I wiped my face and went outside, but this time I wore a long chador that covered me completely. Still, it did nothing to protect me from his prying, invasive eyes. I felt as if his gaze could pierce right through the fabric. When I handed him a glass of juice, he deliberately brushed his hand against mine. The sudden contact sent a shockwave through me, and the glass slipped from my grip, spilling all over his clothes. He stood abruptly, but instead of reacting with anger or frustration, he simply remained calm. My husband, on the other hand, flew into a rage. He slapped me across the face in front of his teacher and began scolding me harshly. The humiliation was unbearable. I never thought my husband would raise his hand against me, especially in front of another man. As I held my stinging cheek, I glanced at the teacher, who was now smirking with a sinister glint in his eyes. I couldn't look at him for more than a moment. His expression was so unsettling, so triumphantly predatory, that I turned and fled to my room. It wasn't even 6 in the evening yet, and I knew he would be staying for dinner before he finally left. I started to worry that my husband might call me out again and humiliate me all over. But fortunately, that never happened. He didn't come to the room again, perhaps out of some semblance of regret. Or so I hoped. But deep down, I knew I was just fooling myself. There was no regret in him. When I opened the door to see who it was my husband. He didn't say anything, just stepped into the room and immediately went to freshen up. I expected that he'd try to console me, to make up for how he had acted before. But to my surprise, he didn't. Instead, he climbed into bed and quickly fell asleep. I lay there in shock, wondering how he could act so indifferent. He hadn't apologized, nor did he even attempt to discuss what had happened. He was making me feel as if everything was my fault, that I was the one entirely to blame. My heart felt heavy, and tears streamed down my face. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind raced with thoughts of how much my life had changed since marrying him. I had given everything to this relationship, yet here I was, feeling neglected and disrespected. Around midnight, unable to contain my frustration any longer, I woke him up. My voice trembling with anger, I asked him what he really wanted, why he was doing all this, and why he was treating me this way. At first, he seemed confused. He was half asleep, but as my words sank in, his expression changed. He sat up, visibly irritated, and snapped, "Stay in your place. You have no right to question me. It's my choice how I treat you, and I'll decide what's best." I was stunned. This didn't sound like my husband. It was as though someone else was speaking through him. I could only sit there, shocked into silence, as he lay back down and drifted off again. The rest of the night I spent awake crying softly into my pillow. The next morning he woke me early. Before I even had a chance to speak, he told me to get ready. We were going to his teacher's house. I refused immediately, saying I had no reason to go there. "He's your teacher, not mine," I said firmly. This only made him angrier. "If you refuse again," he barked, "I'll divorce you on the spot." His threat froze me in place. My mind raced. My husband had become someone I didn't recognize. I felt trapped. Slowly, reluctantly, I got up and prepared myself to go. During the drive, he didn't say a word to me. He just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. I finally decided to break the silence. "Does your teacher have a wife?" I asked. He replied that his teacher had 4 wives. This information shocked me. 4 wives? And yet, despite having a full household, this man still found time to cast his eyes on someone else's wife. I felt disgusted, but I couldn't voice my thoughts. I knew if I said anything negative about his teacher, my husband wouldn't hesitate to make good on his threat. A short while later, the car pulled up in front of a massive mansion. I stared at it in disbelief. The estate was enormous, painted a bright white that gleamed in the sunlight. It was clear that this man was extraordinarily wealthy. I couldn't help but think that his wealth was the reason everyone around him seemed to dance to his tune. As I walked into the grand entrance of this sprawling estate, I felt even more out of place. There wasn't a single man in sight. All the women seemed timid, as if they were always on edge. Master Mullah walked ahead and greeted my husband warmly. Before he could approach me, I quickly stepped aside and struck up a conversation with one of the women standing nearby. I knew my husband noticed my behavior, but I couldn't afford to care. I had my own limits, and I was well aware of how to protect them. We stayed there for about an hour. During that time, my husband chatted nonstop with Master Mullah, while Mullah himself kept looking in my direction. I couldn't shake the feeling that my husband seemed pleased by the way his so-called master ogled me. A surge of anger welled up inside me as I realized my husband's shamelessness. After a while, I excused myself and stepped outside. I struck up a conversation with some of the women gathered there, but their responses were guarded. It was as if they had been pre-warned by Master Mullah. Still, there was one young girl among them who seemed new. As the other women moved away, I approached her. She looked nervous, but when I asked about the situation in the household, she suddenly began to cry. Seeing her tears, I grew worried and quickly looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then I took her to a secluded area behind the mansion. Once there, I asked again, "Why are you crying? Has something happened?" The girl hesitated before finally confessing, "I don't want to stay here, but I can't leave. Please help me get out of here." She started sobbing again, and my heart broke for her. She was so young, and her situation seemed so dire. I asked her why she didn't want to stay. The story she told made my blood boil. She said that Master Mullah constantly harassed her. He looked at her inappropriately and had even tried to get close to her multiple times. He was married, yet that didn't stop him from making advances on her. She also mentioned that every woman in the mansion had some history with him, but none dared to speak up. They were all too afraid of his threats. He had warned them that if they resisted, he would harm their families. I was shocked to hear how far his influence extended. The girl added that Master Mullah didn't just manipulate women. He lured people in by giving them amulets and false hope, often using his wealth and power to control them. When I asked about my husband's involvement, the girl revealed that he had been coming to Master Mullah for 12 years. Hearing that number was like a slap in the face. I realized how deeply my husband must have been brainwashed by this man. For over a decade, he had been under Mullah's influence. My mind raced. What other lies and twisted ideas had Mullah planted in his head? Before I could ask more questions, my husband and Master Mullah appeared. When Mullah saw the young girl standing with me, he paused and then gave me a sly smile. It was as if he knew exactly what I had been doing, yet he remained calm and composed, which only fueled my frustration. His calmness felt like poison to me. "If your investigation is over, may I have my servant return to her work?" he asked, a faint smirk playing on his lips. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. I glanced at my husband, who was glaring at me furiously. At that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense that my marriage was nearing its end. If he continued his antics, I was determined to leave him myself. But I had no idea that something was about to happen to me, something I could never have imagined. That day, as usual, I was home alone, sitting and watching TV, when the doorbell suddenly rang. I quickly got up to answer it, and that's where I made my first mistake. I didn't ask who it was. As soon as I opened the door, I came face to face with Master Mullah. Seeing him there made my breath catch in my throat. Before I could shut the door, He wedged his foot in and with a sinister smile said, "I wasn't sent here by anyone else. Your husband asked me to come. I'm not here without reason. I have important business. So it's better if you let me in quietly. Otherwise, you'll only have yourself to blame." Reluctantly, I let him in and seated him in the living room. While I was in the kitchen preparing juice, my phone rang. It was my husband calling. He was on his way back from the office and instructing me to take good care of Master Mullah, to be polite and make sure he had no complaints. I reassured him, promising I wouldn't do anything that might cause trouble. The night before, I had made up my mind to find a way to free my husband from Mullah's influence. My first step was to win my husband's trust, so I resolved to stay quiet and not argue. But I didn't yet realize how deeply my husband was under Mullah's spell. For over 12 years, this poison had been planted in his mind, and it seemed almost impossible to remove. Lost in these thoughts, I was brainstorming ways to turn my husband against Mullah when I suddenly sensed someone standing extremely close to me. When I turned around, I saw Master Mullah right there, only inches away. If I'd taken a step back, I would have bumped into him. Acting instinctively, I jabbed my elbow into his chest. He cried out in pain, looking ready to curse me out. But then he suddenly stopped. Instead, he smirked and said, "The more you run from me, the more I'll come after you. You'd be better off just giving yourself to me once and for all." I had not expected him to say something so outrageous. I warned him that if he dared to speak that way again, I would tell my husband everything. He simply laughed and replied, "Do you really think your husband would believe you? If you try to tell him, he'll beat you black and blue rather than listen. He's completely under my control. And if I can add to your knowledge, your husband only married you on my command. Before marrying you, he showed me your photo and sought my approval. If I had said no, he never would have gone through with it." Hearing this, my mind reeled. I had never imagined that Mullah's grip over my husband was so strong that even life decisions were dictated by him. I felt a deep regret, realizing I had destroyed my own life by marrying into this nightmare. Mullah then stepped toward me again, trying to grab me, but I quickly sidestepped him. Just then, a knock came at the door. His eyes glinted with malice as he said, "You've escaped me again today, but don't worry." The next day at around 5 in the evening, my husband came home and told me to get ready. When I asked what for, he didn't give me a clear answer. Still, I agreed without putting up a fight and went to prepare myself quickly. For a while, he just stared at me in silence, then grabbed his phone and made a call. About an hour later, there was a knock at the door. As expected, it was Master Mullah again, entering the house with the same smug look on his face. My husband told me to go to my room, and before I could even respond, he firmly instructed, "You must not upset Master Mullah. He will conduct a special session to remove the bad influences around you." Hearing those words made my heart sink. It was painfully clear to me now. Not only had my husband turned a blind eye to this man's behavior, but he was actively aiding him. The very walls of my home no longer felt safe, and I knew I couldn't rely on anyone but myself to put an end to this nightmare. So I retreated to my room, my mind racing, as I tried to piece together a plan. Moments later, Master Mullah entered. I didn't let him get close this time. Instead, I confronted him, demanding to know about his past. I raised my voice, pushing him to tell the truth. Anger flared in his eyes, and before long, he began boasting about his misdeeds. He confessed how he had manipulated countless women and, most disturbingly, how he had brought my husband into his schemes. "Your husband was just another pawn," he sneered. "I used him to get to you, and I'll use anyone to keep my empire running." As he spoke, I discreetly recorded everything. His arrogance and the twisted satisfaction on his face made my stomach turn, but I kept pressing, making sure I captured every detail. The more he revealed, the more I understood the horrifying truth. My husband wasn't just a victim, he was a willing accomplice. They had worked together to lure unsuspecting women into their trap, marrying them, having children, and then selling the children for profit. My husband's supposed desire for a son wasn't about starting a family, it was about increasing their sick inventory. Just then, there was another knock at the door. I knew who it was. My brother had arrived, and he wasn't alone. He had brought the police. As the authorities entered, Master Mullah's smug expression faltered for the first time. They caught him red-handed, and he tried to deny everything, but I had the recordings. The truth was laid bare for everyone to see. My husband's role in this twisted operation was exposed as well. It was finally over. Master Mola and my husband were arrested on the spot. I felt a sense of relief mixed with deep sadness. Even though justice was served, it was hard to come to terms with what had happened. I had once trusted my husband, but he had betrayed me in ways I never could have imagined. I was free, yes, but I was also left to rebuild my life from scratch. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision to start working. I needed to find a way to stand on my own feet. I found a job at a reputable firm and threw myself into my work. Slowly but surely, I began to heal. My family stood by me, offering their support and encouraging me to move forward. And then after some time, I met someone at the firm who treated me with kindness and respect. This person showed me that I could trust again, that not everyone was like my husband or Master Mola. With my family's blessing, I remarried. This time I chose someone who valued me for who I was, someone who stood by me through thick and thin. My second marriage was built on honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't easy to start over, but I did. I learned to trust again, to love again, and to believe that there was still good in the world. The journey was painful and riddled with challenges, but it ultimately led me to a place of peace and stability. I found happiness in building a life with someone who genuinely cared for me, and I realized that my worth wasn't determined by my past experiences or the people who tried to bring me down. I could stand tall, move forward, and create a future filled with hope,